Hey guys, welcome back to a new crazy crafting project. We did something we've never done before. For this project we are partnering up with Ubisoft's Massive Entertainment to celebrate the release of their new game Star Wars Outlaws. It is the first open world game set in the Star Wars universe and takes place between the events of The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. During this time the Galactic Empire is fighting harder against the Rebel Alliance and crime is on the rise. You take on the role of Kay Vess, a cunning scoundrel navigating the galactic underworld, and your actions will impact your standing with various crime syndicates, making alliances and enemies based on the missions you complete. But you know what's best about the game? Kay Vess' trusty sidekick Nix. Isn't he cute? And we had the honor to bring Nix into the real world. Star Wars is known for its creative ideas to bring their creatures to life, so we took this as an inspiration and thought, why not creating a hand puppet? We've never done this before and we only had 4 weeks to finish this project, so if you want to see how we made it, lean back and enjoy. We started this project by brainstorming and doing research on how to build a puppet. It's not like there's an instruction manual you can follow, but you can find a lot of inspiration online how other people made their puppets. It just took us a lot of time to figure out how this would work for our project.
We got provided the 3D files of Nix so I could use them as a base for my work. First I started thinking about how to separate the body parts to create an articulated puppet, where I could add joints, if this would later work in combination with the fur and the scales. There was a lot to consider. The most complex part was the head and the eye mechanism, because we wanted Nix to be able not only to blink with his eyes, but also to move his eyeballs. And of course we also wanted him to be able to open and close his mouth. I printed several prototypes to test the mechanism, and at some point I just lost track of how many times I printed new parts, did a test, only to find out it wasn't working, changed the 3D model, printed it again, until I finally had my first prototype that worked well.
In the meantime, I worked on the skin. The plan was to make this skin out of silicone so we could open the mouth and do the eye blink mechanism, but we didn't think that this would be the most challenging part of this project. I printed the face and made a very, let's say, simple mold with a brush on silicone and plaster bandages to keep the mold in shape. This was supposed to be our test skin to see if our plan would work out. I wanted to make a better and more clean mold for the final face later. When the mold was done, I cast the first face. The idea was to get a silicone cast with an even thickness by pressing in a positive of the face, which was slightly smaller than the face I just molded. It's the same technique I used when I make prosthetics for makeup. The test cast worked out incredibly well, so I could go on with testing the hair punching and also figuring out a good way to apply fiber flocking. What I loved the most about this project was that I could work with techniques which I've never used before, like electrostatic flocking. Ralph could use the skin to see how well it works with the mechanics. And well, at that point we were still optimistic about the eye blink mechanism, but there were a few things we didn't consider.
Still being super optimistic, I went on finalizing the face mechanics. We all know it's what's on the inside that counts. So this is the final 3D model of the inside of Nix's head. I printed all the pieces and then came the fun part, assembling everything and checking if it works. I always enjoy this process, so I hope you do too.
While Ralph was happily working on the face mechanics, I worked on the eyes. I printed the eyeballs with resin. Yes, I always print a second pair in case I mess it up. And then I gave them a bright green paint job. I filled the pupil with resin to avoid air bubbles getting trapped later in the pressure pot. I needed to make a mold for the clear part of the eyeballs. These spheres are also 3D printed, sanded and polished to a shiny surface. the polishing makes a huge difference. I made a super simple block mold. I know I always say I love to make complicated molds, but from time to time it's pretty nice to keep it easy. I filled the molds with epoxy resin and pressed in the ice. To get a clear result without any bubbles, the ice had to go into the pressure pot. A few hours later I could demold them and they turned out perfect. Ralph could then add the ice to the mechanism, and this was the first time our vision was starting to come to life. I love how he's able to move the eyes from left to right. With the thumb you control the eye blink and the eyeballs, and with the fingers you can open the mouth. The under construction of the head was done, so we could focus on working on the skin. Making the skin was more of a challenge than we expected, mostly because of the eye blink of the lower eyelid. Nick's eyes are very close to his mouth, but the eyelid needs space to fold inside. But there was no space. So when the lower eyelid was folding inwards, it also moved the upper lip, which was looking so strange. But we didn't want to give up and tried to cast the eyelids as thin as possible and tried out different silicones, but nothing was working. So we decided to cut off the eyelids and make the face and the eyelids separate silicone pieces. Ralph modified the 3D model and removed the eyelids. This was going to be the final mold, so we did a resin print. I still can't get over how good these prints look. I prepped the print for molding and applied a few coats of brush-on silicone. To make sure the mold stays in shape, I made a shell out of epoxy resin. For extra durability, I also added fiberglass cloth and I also added these feet at the bottom. This makes the casting process a lot easier. Ralph always helps me with the demolding process. You sometimes need a lot of biceps power for that. And then we had a very pretty and happy mold. The casting process was basically the same we've seen before for the test skin, the only difference being that this time we don't have eyelids. It looked pretty funny without the eyes, and for the mouth something very important was also missing. Because we wanted to make it possible to open the mouth, we of course also had to create the inside of the mouth. For an easier casting process, we separated the mouth into two pieces. I made a mold of both parts and started the casting by filling the teeth with white tinted silicone. I was not sure about making the teeth out of silicone, but it worked incredibly well. For the gums and the tongue, I tinted the silicone pink. I painted on some additional shades for a more realistic look and glued both parts together. The mouth definitely gave me a lot of joy. Then I could finally glue the mouth to the face. And I was happy that I was done with another small step.
Back to the eyes. I had to rethink the whole eyelid situation and 3D modeled new eyelids which fitted perfectly to the eye mechanism. But this time the eyelids were open, not closed like before. We hoped that this would improve the natural movement.
So we printed the new eyelids and prepped them for molding. I made a cute little brush-on mold with a shell out of Worbla leftovers. I can, by the way, really recommend using Worbla for a small mold shell when you don't have much time. The eyelids needed to be as flexible as possible, so I brushed in two very thin coats of silicone. As you can see here, it was super thin, but just perfect for us. Then I gave the eyelids a pretty paint job and we could finally add them to the eye mechanism. This was the moment of truth and we were so relieved how good this worked. We did a quick test with the skin, and after all the failures we had with the skin and the eyes, it was so good to finally see that our new plan was working out. For Nick's feet, I wanted to go back to my roots and do some traditional sculpting. I really enjoy sculpting, but I don't do it as often as I did in the past before all the 3D modeling. Sculpting can be a very calming process, but it takes time. I enjoyed working on these super cute tiny feet. I think it was the first time I sculpted feet. Although I'm not sure, are these feet or paws? Let me know what you think. The tiny claws were 3D printed and added to the sculpt. I have these super fancy texture stamps which were perfect for adding texture to the bottom side of Nick's feet. This worked so well and saved me a lot of time. Sculpting all feet took me a few days, and then I decided I also wanted to sculpt the tip of the tail. For the casting process, I had to remove the claws again. For separating the mold, I needed a super soft clay that would not destroy my sculpture. I sculpted the feet with an oil-based clay with medium hardness, but it never dries. It's a little bit like wax. And you have to handle it very carefully when making a mold. For molding, I use my trusty brush on silicone. I had to make a 2-part mold, which is a bit of a more complex process and takes a few days. You first make one half of the mold, remove the soft clay you used for the separation, and then repeat the whole process for the second half of the mold. I kind of enjoy this process. It's one of the crafting skills where I think I know what I'm doing, and mostly everything goes well. After opening the mold and removing the clay master, I went straight into silicone casting. I brushed silicone into both sides of the mold, closed it, the wing screws make sure both halves are pressed together very tight, then added a silicone foam, and I could already demold the finished feet. They turned out so cute. I just had to cut off the fleshing and could already start with the paint job. When you're painting silicone, you can't use normal paint. You basically only can paint silicone with thinned down silicone, which you tint with special pigments. The feet were looking cute, so I could glue on the claws. I painted the cloth with thinned acrylic paint, so they look a lot more natural. To finish the look of the feet, I added a lizard skin texture. The stencil for that was made with our laser cutter. The feet were quite a lot of work, but they turned out so cool.
So, I had to make an articulated puppet body. The legs should be movable and the tail should be super flexible. For the legs I created ball joints. I was not sure how well this would later work with the fur, but this was the best solution I came up with. The tail was separated into many pieces which were later connected with a cord. Laura needed the body for making the sewing pattern, so I printed all the parts and assembled them. That way I could also test if the ball joints were working as planned. For the final Nyx puppet, I of course changed the tail, but this one was better for pattern making.
Another challenge was to find the perfect fur for Nyx, and I'm very picky when it comes to fake fur. So I ordered a bunch of samples from shops in different countries, but they didn't have the right color, texture or length. But of course, I still managed to find a fur that was just perfect. For making the pattern, I covered the whole body in tape, marked the cutting lines and cut them with an X-Acto knife. I've been making cosplays for 12 years and this was one of the first techniques I've learned, and it is still the best to create pattern, either for sewing or armor making. All patterns were then traced onto this beautiful fake fur and cut out. I had to sew all the pieces together by hand, which took a while, but of course I had my little cat helper with me. In the meantime, Ralph could assemble the tail and add it to the body. The tail would lose some of its flexibility due to the fur and the scales, but it was still super cool. I added the fur to the body and did a quick test to check the movement of the legs. Still worked pretty well. I added the feet to the legs and you can see the fur was way too long, so it needed a little trim. The body was slowly coming together, but it also needed a new haircut. I especially had to trim the fur on the back, where I later had to add all the scales. Cutting the fur made me so nervous. Once it's cut off, it's gone, so there was no room for mistakes. For the facial hair, I applied glue and added pieces of fake fur. There are not many glues that will stick to silicone, but Pros-Aide worked incredibly well here. For the short facial hair, I used an electrostatic flocking machine. It was the first time ever I used one of these and it was so much fun. I'm still blown away by how good this looks. Once I added the flocking, I used my airbrush and a toothbrush to gently push the fur into the right direction. It was so satisfying to finally see his face with all the fluffy fur. Then only the ear flaps, or should we call them antennas, were missing, and the cute boy was already looking like he was nearly done. But he still needed his scales, and he has a nice colorful gradient on his tail, legs and ears. So I took him apart and started airbrushing his legs. To get the perfect gradient like in the game, I worked with 5 different colors. I always started with a bright red, then a bright orange, added a darker red and a very dark brown to the tips, and finished the look with a beige that was slightly darker than the original fur color to blend everything together. I also added some shades and highlights to the fur on the face, and then only one thing was missing. It was time for the last part of bringing Nyx to life. I had to make 500 scales. For that, Ralph 3D modeled and printed these molds for me. Nyx has 6 different scale sizes, so this was a brilliant idea and it saved me so much time. I first wanted to make them out of foam, but this would have never turned out so well as the resin cast scales. And it would have taken forever. I mean, filling the molds, demolding, cleaning the edges also took forever, but it was still very effective. Before painting, I had to wash each scale to remove the release agent from the casting process. Otherwise, the paint will not stick very well to the surface. Look at me, questioning my life. How did I end up here washing 500 scales by hand? For painting, I glued all the scales onto a cardboard. This took a while, but it speeded up the painting process a lot. All the scales got a bright base coat and then I dry brushed a dark blue on top. If you ever have to paint the same detail 100 times, I can really recommend going the extra mile and doing it like this. The last step was to seal the paint, and I could already start gluing them to the body. As glue, I use my trusty hot glue. If you want to glue anything onto fur, hot glue is the way to go. With each scale I added, Nyx came more and more to life. Gluing on all the scales took me 2 very long days. What took the most time was heating up the scales and bending them into shape. I didn't have to do this with all of them, but in some areas the flat scales were not working with the body shape. I also had to make sure the scales didn't constrain the movement of the legs. And I'm super proud how well I managed that. I added the last scales to his face, and then our little boy was finally done. I can't believe we managed to finish this project in only 4 weeks, since it was our first time building something like this with the eye mechanism and all the other things we had to consider. It was a challenge, but we somehow made it. So if you want to spend more time with Nyx, make sure to check out Star Wars Outlaws and explore the galactic underworld with your little companion. And now let me finally show you our cute little friend.